Hey guys, it's Danny. Welcome to another Orchid Care for Beginners series. I was about to say Q&A. Today, we shall continue the trend that we started last month of just demystifying a little bit certain subjects for long-term success. We're still beginner friendly, don't worry, but we are moving a little bit along in time. Even if you're still beginners, I'm sure you're already maybe at the 1 year mark or you're wondering, okay, what am I gonna do in 2 years from now? I would like to know so I can prepare. So this year is exactly doing that. And today we are going to be talking about repotting. I just repotted this orchid recently. And I'm not gonna show you how to repot. We did that a few years ago. I'll link you to that video down below if you're actually wanting to see proper repotting. I have my first tutorial, I'll link you to it down below where I repot 3 phalaenopsis. Today we are talking about some myths, some truths, and some things you should know or just prepare for, let's say, for long-term success. And before we start, today's episode, together with this entire series, is of course sponsored by repotme.com, who offers you everything you could possibly need to properly take care of your orchids. From potting mixes to pots, fertilizers, accessories, grow lights, and everything in between. And not only for orchids, but for other houseplants as well, such as cacti and succulents. So I'll link it down below to their website, and I'll also share with you the products that I'm really enjoying. Currently, I'm going to add the grow lights down below because I'm really enjoying them actually. So you have everything down below in the description and also in the pinned comment. Feel free to check them out at any time. And with that said, let us start. I have a list as always. I'm very professional because I don't want to forget anything. Right, so let's start with the first point. Is repotting really necessary? And this is one of the very common comments that I get sometimes. Why do you have to repot orchids? In nature, nobody repots them. Or I have an orchid that I didn't repot in 3 years and it's doing great. And well, to address all of these things, once you get an orchid, yes, you will have to repot it at some point. And that is not the rules of nature, has nothing to do with nature. It has to do with the fact that we are growing these orchids in our homes. And to better take care of them with our possibilities, we most of the times have to pot them. Well, everything is great, and it became very easy for us to grow orchids because they're potted, but every good thing comes with some bad things. And in our case, repotting periodically, it's the quote-unquote bad thing about potting orchids. If you will, it is just a byproduct of growing our orchids as comfortably as we do in our own homes. So what happens if we don't repot? Will our orchid die? Well, most likely, no. It will not die. At least not now. The problem is you cannot really tell if your orchid will start to suffer or not, because another byproduct of the way we grow orchids is that this medium that we're using at some point goes bad. If it is organic, it starts to break down and it becomes unsuitable for orchid roots and actually damaging. If we're not using organic materials, we're using something like leca or something inorganic, we still will need to repot because these orchids will outgrow their pot. And even if outgrowing is not really harming them, we're going to talk about it, it will become less and less easy for us to take care of them if they take over all of the pot, if they remove the soil or materials in the pot, and in the end you're left only with the root ball. So no, not repotting will not kill your orchid, especially not overnight. It might in the long term, it's really relative. We're dealing with live things, so we don't really know the outcome, but because we don't want to play this roulette, it is much better to repot them periodically to avoid, if not killing the orchid, at least making it sick, setting it back, or having just a horrible time growing it. And speaking about crowded orchids and outgrowing quote-unquote their pot, will orchids stop growing or suffer if they become very crowded in the pot? I have an example here to show you. I cannot even lift this orchid out of its pot. It is full of roots. This is one of my biggest root producers. And well, the answer is no, they will not stop growing. That's part of the problem and why sometimes we need to repot simply because we don't have space anymore. They will not stop growing. They will continuously grow. What will happen is they will require more and more water because you won't have that medium to provide the water. You will just have roots which will absorb the water just like that. So you'll have to water much more frequent. And if you don't water as frequent as your very crowded orchid desires, then you will suffer some dehydration, and with dehydration can come stress, and you might have some declining orchids. But basically, no, the fact that your orchids are crowded means nothing. They will keep growing and grow and grow, and they will take over your house pretty much, like this bronze maiden does now. It needs a repot. But hey, we can always opt for a bigger pot, right? Does the size actually matter when we repot? Well, yes and no. I feel personally that we're putting a little bit too much emphasis on the size of the pot. You don't want the pot to be too big, but not too small, or rather go for smaller pots than bigger pots. And really, the outcome of that will be highly dependent on your environment. For me, living mainly in warm climates, overpotting is a joy. When I have the opportunity to put a small orchid in a big pot, I take it, because big pots retain more water, and in my environment, that is what I need. Plus, if the pot is bigger, the orchid can sit in the same pot for longer, especially if you're dealing with a very fast-growing orchid, such as the little bronze maiden here, which is anything but little at this point. It used to be little. So the pot size, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't matter all that much, but the ability of you to adjust the size to fit your orchid, to make sure you leave enough room for about 2 years of comfortable growth for your orchid and comfortable maintenance for you. And also, make sure that it's not the most ginormous pot that will never dry. We are trying to be sensible here. Yes, I love overpotting orchids because it works well for me, but I'm not gonna get a 10-gallon pot for a tiny mini phalaenopsis. If I really wanted to, I could get away with it, but I'm not gonna do so. It's too much. It's not sensible at all. But honestly, long term, I think you should just not stress so much over pot size, but rather focus on choosing the best potting materials to suit your orchid and your environment better. And speaking about potting materials, here's the good news, because orchids are epiphytic and they're not really so dependent on soil type mediums. The sky's the limit when it comes to the choice of medium you are going to use. In my experience, I've developed a guideline of 3 rules to follow when you're trying to use a medium. First, your medium needs to provide air pockets, so it shouldn't be very fine. It should be a little bit more on the chunky side, whether it's not very chunky or very chunky. 2, it needs to provide some water retention. It could be less water retention or more, but it has to be some water retention, because you don't want to water every day or twice a day or 3 times a day, especially in a living room setting. And 3, the third rule, make sure your potting mix is not chemically or physically damaging to your orchid. Chemically can mean a very, very low pH. It can mean a medium that is very acidic, that it burns roots. Old potting mixes tend to do that. And also physically unsuitable means maybe abrasive type of media. We won't try to grow our orchids in sandpaper. They might be able to grow, but I don't think the roots will have a great time. So make sure that these 3 rules are followed and the sky's the limit pretty much. I have a saying, if you want to grow your orchid in Lego pieces, you can. If you can maintain it, if you can keep up with watering and stuff, you can grow your orchid in a Lego set. That's a great idea that I might try one day. So if you can grow your orchid in a Lego set, why don't we? Why do most people use either bark or sphagnum moss or coconut chips or leca? There seem to be a few potting media that are more popular than others, right? Well, because they've just been proven over and over again, and they do provide a little more than those 3 rules. So let's take, for example, sphagnum moss or bark, which are actually the most popular media you can use for orchids. Sphagnum moss retains a lot of water, and in some environments, that's a great thing. For me, it's exceptional. It can also provide air pockets, tiny air pockets. And it's also physically and chemically very suitable for orchids because it is slightly acidic, and this makes uptake of nutrients really favorable. Bark is the same. It's a lot chunkier than sphagnum moss, so it retains bigger air pockets, and in some environments, that's what you need. It doesn't retain as much water, but it retains some in the gaps in between the pieces. And again, for some environments, that's what you need, and it is, again, slightly acidic, which makes nutrient uptake favorable. For example, Lego pieces, they do provide air pockets, given sometimes maybe a lot bigger air pockets than maybe bark would, and definitely more air pockets than sphagnum moss would. It's also non-water retentive because it's bits of plastic. It does not absorb water. It can retain water though in the little grooves, right, in the little channels. But for the roots to reach there, they actually have to travel there. The medium itself will not like be absorbent or anything, so that's an inconvenience. And 3, it doesn't really chemically alter the environment way too much, which is a good thing. It's not going to burn our orchid, but it's also a bad thing because nutrient uptake is not as good as it would be, let's say, in bark or sphagnum moss. So that's why, in short, some materials are more popular than others. It also has to do with how available they are, how cheap or easy they are to acquire. Bark is a byproduct of the furniture industry, I believe. In some areas of the world, coconut husk is abundant and it's cheap and, you know, it's reused and it's great. In other parts of the world, sphagnum moss is more abundant and so on and so forth. So there are a few reasons why some materials are more chosen than others, but again, if you're creative enough, you can grow your orchids in whatever. Right, I seem to be really keen on showing you orchids that need to be repotted. So how often should we repot orchids? Well, there isn't a specific number of years. In past tutorials or articles on the internet, you will see repot every 2 years or so. That's very relative. That's a very big generalization, and everything has to do with your environment, the type of orchid you have, how comfortable you are still maintaining it, and so on. So rule number 1, when the potting mix goes bad, because broken down potting mixes, if they're organic, they can become more acidic than they should be, and they can start to affect the roots. So the best way to tell if your potting mix is done is to water it and then sniff it. If it smells like mold, it is time for you to repot. Get rid of that medium, offer fresh medium. If it still smells okay, good. It can go for maybe another year. And a second thing to keep in mind is how comfortable you are taking care of your orchid. Obviously, as I was saying, orchids don't mind if they're crowded. They will still grow. That's the problem. They always grow. If the potting mix is almost inexistent anymore because you have a mess of roots, obviously you'll have to water much more frequent, and maybe you're just not comfortable with that. And that in turn will affect the orchid. So if you feel like you need to water more often than you should, then a repot is in order, and most likely a bigger pot is in order as well. So how often you should repot will depend. Every year, 2 years, 4 years even, depending on these 2 things that I told you about, and also, of course, the quality of your medium, which will dictate how long it stays in good condition. Lower quality media obviously will degrade faster. Media that usually stay more moist than dry will tend to degrade faster as well. If you apply that rule that I told you to sniff, I'm not even joking, just sniff that potting mix, you should be good. So does the pot actually matter? Well, yes and no. As long as it suits you, it's absolutely fine. Now, you might have noticed in all of my beginner tutorials, I always use those transparent pots that have extra ventilation. That's because I believe they're the safest. And when you're at the beginning, you have to start from somewhere. Might as well start with the safest alternative. A transparent pot that lets you see the roots, lets you see when the medium is dry, also has extra ventilation, just in case your environment is more on the humid side or cooler side, or the potting mix you're using, maybe it's more water retentive than it should be. There are many benefits of those pots, especially at the beginning. When you start to understand your orchids and your environment more, you can discover that maybe those pots are not the best suited for you. Maybe you'd like to go for self-watering pots, which I tend to use a lot. You might decide to go for clay pots, which don't let you see the roots, but they are very breathable, and maybe in cooler and more humid environments, they work terrific. And it doesn't matter that you don't see the roots. Everything has pros and cons. In the end, again, the sky's the limit. As long as it suits your needs, the pot is great. So from this point on, let's say you've had your orchids in those transparent pots with extra ventilation slits. If you want to try out other stuff, try with a few orchids. And first, before you try anything, think a little bit about your environment. Is it rather dry? Is it rather warm? Do you have to water your orchids infrequently or too frequently? And that will give you an idea of what type of pot maybe is prone to success. Right, so to end the video, let's talk about some drawbacks and some positives of potting and keeping orchids potted. Let's talk about the drawbacks first, right? What are the drawbacks? Well, first of all, we're keeping our orchids in a rather unnatural state. Orchids, most of them will grow a little bit differently naturally in their trees. Let's take phalaenopsis, for example. In a tree or on a tree, it will grow a lot more slanted. And this has a lot of benefits. One of them is avoiding crown rot and stem rot and all of those things, which if we're trying to grow our orchids upright, it's more prone to happen. So we are interfering a little bit with the natural way orchids might grow. Not all of them, but at least some of them. And that has some consequences that we need to keep in mind, such as the whole water pulling in the crown situation. Also, because we keep them potted, we have to change the medium in the pot regularly. Not necessarily frequently, but regularly for sure, because what we're using here will start to break down. It is not a live tree in nature. So those are the major drawbacks of repotting. It needs a little bit of investment, it needs a little bit of time, and it alters a little bit the natural type of growth. But does it really matter? No, because the positives of keeping orchids potted are, in my opinion, way more important. For example, you and me, we are able to grow orchids in our living room next to our TV. Stop for a second and think about that a little bit. People a few hundred years ago could not even fathom that would be possible. Because they did not have TVs, duh. Seriously though. Yes, because we are potting orchids and we use the potting mixes and the pots that we use nowadays, it is possible for the vast majority of us to actually be capable of having these wonderful, amazing plants on our dining room table, next to our TV, in a bedroom. I do what I do in a bedroom, all because of pots. What an amazing discovery pots and potting in general is. So yeah, we will have to put up with some inconveniences and some maintenance related things, but the outcome of using pots is all of this. And I think it's worth it, right? Now, if you're lucky enough to maybe live in an environment where you can grow your orchids on your trees outside, potting is nothing for you. But for the vast majority of us, I believe that maybe live in totally unsuitable climates, potting has really made it possible to grow these orchids in our homes. And for that, I am grateful. I'm grateful for the advancements in pot design and potting medium and all of that, because it just makes everything possible. And in the end, that is the core of growing orchids, potting. And then watering and fertilizing and so on. But first of all, it is potting. And I hope this video kind of demystified a few things for you if you had some questions for long-term success. This series, as I was saying, is aimed for long-term, not just having an orchid for a few months and then off in the trash it goes. We don't do that here on this channel. And if you have other subjects that you'd like me to demystify, beginner related as well, but like second step of beginner phase, let's say, leave me a comment down below and I'll try to make a video about it. Right, so for today, that is about it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Thank you, rePotme. rePotme. Why do you think rePotme is named rePotme? Because it's important to repot. All right, so thank you, rePotme, for sponsoring yet another video. And with that said, I hope you'll have a great day and I'll see you next time. Bye.